brother-in-law stood up at the head of the conference table on a Thursday morning in October and said, "Cole, I think it's time we talked about succession planning. The board feels we need someone with a long runway ahead of them in the operations chair." He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at the wall clock above the door, like he was timing how long it would take me to understand what had just happened. There were 11 people in that room. The general manager from our Phoenix yard, 2 regional sales leads who had been with me since the early days, the CFO, a woman named Diane who had hired on 3 years after I did, and who suddenly became extremely interested in her notepad. Outside the window, I could see the Front Range, the snow line creeping down the foothills, the way it does the second week of October in Colorado. Inside, the HVAC clicked on with that little metallic ping it always makes, and nobody said a word. That was the moment, right there, in a glass-walled conference room on the second floor of our headquarters in Loveland, with the Rockies looking in like they always do on a perfectly ordinary Thursday. My name is Cole Mathers. I'm 54 years old, and for 19 years I ran Reeves Industrial Supply, a $38 million a year fastener and industrial parts distributor serving the oil and gas corridor from Wyoming down through New Mexico, even though my name has never appeared on a single ownership document. I should back up. I met my wife, Tessa, at a wedding in Fort Collins when I was 33. She was the maid of honor. I was a college friend of the groom. We danced once, talked outside on the patio for 2 hours about absolutely nothing important, and I called her the next morning before I'd even had coffee. We were married 14 months later in a small ceremony at her parents' ranch outside of Berthoud. Her family owned Reeves Industrial Supply. Her father, Hollis Reeves, had started it in 1978 with a single warehouse and a used flatbed truck, supplying bolts and brackets to oil rigs out in the Niobrara Shale. Her older brother, Garrett, had grown up in the warehouse, started running deliveries when he was 16, and was being groomed to take over from the day he could drive a forklift. By the time I met Tessa, Hollis was 68 and easing out, and Garrett was 39 and the heir apparent. When Tessa told her dad I had a background in industrial procurement, 8 years at a mining supply company in Casper, plus a logistics degree from Colorado State, Hollis offered me a job before the wedding invitations had even gone out. Director of Operations, decent salary, no equity, and a handshake promise that if I proved myself, there would be conversations about ownership down the road. I took it. Tessa wanted me close to her family. I wanted to build something. And I genuinely believed Hollis when he said it. Reeves Industrial in 2005 was a mess. 3 warehouses, all running on different inventory systems. A sales team that operated mostly on personal relationships and gut feel. Margins so thin in some product lines, we were actually losing money on every order and making it up in volume, which is the kind of math that should disqualify you from running a lemonade stand, let alone a multi-million-dollar distributor. So I fixed it. Slowly. One thing at a time, the way you fix anything real. I integrated the inventory systems in my first 18 months, renegotiated our 2 largest supplier contracts in year 3, saving the company close to $400,000 annually. In year 5, I built out a custom procurement and logistics tracking platform from scratch. Using a software framework I taught myself nights and weekends at the kitchen table, while Tessa graded papers on the other end. By year 8, we'd opened 2 new yards, one in Farmington, New Mexico, one in Casper, Wyoming. By year 12, we'd locked down our first federal contract, supplying fasteners, brackets, and industrial-grade fittings to a Bureau of Land Management Infrastructure program, worth $2.3 million a year. By the time my brother-in-law made his little speech in the conference room, Reeves Industrial had 4 warehouses, 63 employees, 4 federal supply contracts totaling about $11 million annually, and was the dominant mid-tier distributor for a stretch of the Rocky Mountain Energy Corridor that ran 1,000 miles north to south. Hollis had given me the title of Chief Operating Officer somewhere around year 10. He'd never given me equity. He'd never put me on the board. My salary was $142,000, which, for a COO running a company that size in 2024 dollars, was a joke. I knew it was a joke. Tessa knew it was a joke. Tessa knew it was a joke. Hollis knew it too. He just figured I'd never push. Here's the thing about marrying into a family business. You're not really part of it. Not the way they are. You're the spouse. You're the helpful one. You're the guy at Thanksgiving who carves the turkey because he's good at it, but doesn't get a vote on what time we eat. I understood that, in a vague kind of way, for most of those 19 years. I told myself the work was the point. I told myself Hollis would come around. I told myself a lot of things. And then Garrett's son, Bo, finished his MBA at Pepperdine. Bo was 28, tan in a way you only get from never having held a real job, dressed like a guy who'd seen a lot of TED Talks. He came back to Loveland in late summer, started showing up at the headquarters in a slim-cut suit, and within about a month was sitting in on operations meetings he had no business being in, asking questions like, "What's our customer acquisition cost on the federal vertical?" while our regional manager from Casper just stared at him with the expression of a man watching a horse try to read a newspaper. I was patient with the kid. I'd been patient with worse. I walked him through our procurement systems, our supplier hierarchies, our federal compliance protocols. He took notes on an iPad and asked thoughtful-sounding questions that occasionally connected to reality. I figured he was being eased in slowly, given a year or two to learn the actual business before any real decisions got made about his role. That was generous of me, in retrospect. The Thursday meeting was billed as a quarterly operations review. I walked in with my usual stack of reports, fuel cost analyses, supplier renewal timelines, the federal contract performance metrics, and sat down expecting a normal 3-hour grind. Garrett walked in 5 minutes late, sat at the head of the table where Hollis used to sit before he retired to fly fishing full-time, and gave a short speech about strategic vision. Then he announced that effective November 1st, Bo would be assuming the role of Chief Operating Officer, and I would be transitioning to a senior advisory role to ensure continuity during the leadership transition. He didn't look at me. He looked at the wall clock. I watched Diane, the CFO, study her notepad. I watched our Phoenix yard manager, a guy named Ronnie who I had personally promoted twice, look at the ceiling tiles. I watched the snow line on the front range. The HVAC clicked. I asked very evenly what senior advisory meant in terms of authority and compensation. Garrett said the details were still being worked out, but there would be no significant changes to your day-to-day for the first 90 days while Bo gets settled in. He used the phrase passing the torch. He used the phrase massing the torch. He used the phrase next chapter. He used the phrase Reeves family legacy twice. I sat there for the rest of that meeting. 40 more minutes. I took notes. I asked 1 or 2 clarifying questions about the supply contract renewals coming up in Q1. Questions Bo couldn't have answered if his life depended on it, which he proved by deferring to me both times. I shook everyone's hand at the end. I walked back to my office, closed the door behind me for what I think was only the 3rd time in 19 years, and sat down. On the corner of my desk was a leather portfolio I'd carried in and out of that building since 2005. Black, scuffed at the edges, with a brass zipper that had broken twice and been repaired both times by the same shoe repair guy in Greeley. Inside it were my working notes, the real ones, not the formal documentation that lived on the company server. The actual decision-making logic behind every contract I'd negotiated. The personal cell phone numbers of every supplier rep and procurement officer I dealt with over 2 decades. The pricing histories. The handshake understandings. The call, this guy, if X happens. Notes that you don't put in any official file because they're too human. 19 years of institutional knowledge in my own handwriting. None of it on a Reeves server. None of it backed up to anything Garrett or Bo could touch. I sat there for a long time, maybe 45 minutes. The light through the office window went from harsh midday to that flat gold color you get in Colorado in the afternoon. I didn't cry. I didn't punch the wall. I didn't do anything dramatic. Mostly I just felt very, very tired. Then I picked up the portfolio, put it in my briefcase, and drove home. Tessa was in the kitchen when I got there. She'd already heard. Her mother had called her around 2 p.m., apparently with some version of the news framed as a really exciting development for the Reeves legacy. Tessa was leaning against the counter with her arms crossed, and when I walked in, she didn't say anything for a minute. Then she said, "I'm so sorry, Cole." I told her I was okay. She gave me a look that said she didn't believe me, and she was right not to. We sat at the kitchen table that night, and we talked, really talked, in a way we hadn't talked in a long time. She told me she'd had a feeling something like this might happen ever since Bo came back from California. She told me her father had said something at the 4th of July barbecue that had stuck with her. A comment about Garrett needing to start positioning his own kids, and she dismissed it at the time, but now she wasn't sure. She said, "Dad built a small company. You build the company we have now. Those are not the same thing. They've never been the same thing." She said it quietly, the way you say something you've been holding for a while and finally decided to put down. I told her I needed a few days to think. She said, "Take a week. Take 2. Take whatever you need." I took 5 days. I told the office I was working from home on a federal compliance audit, which was technically true, just not in the way they assumed. I sat at my kitchen table with the leather portfolio open and went through it page by page, and I did something I had never let myself do in 19 years. I did the math. 4 federal contracts, $11.2 million in annual revenue. I was the named technical contact on every single one. Not Hollis, not Garrett, not the company, me. 2 of those contracts had specific continuity of personnel clauses I had personally drafted into them, way back when I was just trying to make sure clients would have a stable point of contact through internal company changes. I'd written those clauses 10 years ago without really thinking about what they meant for me personally. I was just protecting the relationships. It turns out I was also protecting myself, even though I hadn't known it. I pulled up the actual contract documents on my laptop, copies I'd kept on my personal cloud drive for years as backup, because that's what you do when you're the kind of person who doesn't trust office IT departments. And I read those continuity clauses 3 times. Slowly. Then I looked at the procurement and logistics platform I'd built in year 5. It lived on a personal Alzheimer's account I'd set up under my own name in 2010. I'd built it on my own time, on my own laptop, before Reeves had any IT infrastructure worth mentioning. Hollis had paid for the arsomoizing through company expense reimbursement for years, without ever asking what it was actually hosting. There was no IP assignment clause in my original employment agreement. There was no clause assigning work product to the company. Hollis's lawyer in 2005 had been a guy named Marv, who mostly did real estate closings and traffic tickets, and Marv had given Hollis a generic offer letter template he'd downloaded from a legal forms website. The system that handled the routing logic, the supplier integration, and the customer-facing tracking portal for every single one of our 4 federal contracts, the system that had reduced our logistics costs by 22% over the last decade, had never been formally transferred to Reeves Industrial Supply. It was sitting on my Arsamouse account, with my name on it. I closed the laptop and sat there with my coffee going cold. I want to be careful about how I describe what I felt. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was something quieter and stranger, like the feeling of finally finding your wallet after you'd already started to accept you were going to have to cancel all your cards. A little exhalation, a little reorientation. I'd spent 19 years acting in good faith. I'd shared everything I built without ever asking for protection in return, because it had never occurred to me that I would need it. That wasn't naivete. That wasn't trust. And trust, I was learning, is worth exactly what the other person decides to make it worth. I thought about a guy named Wes Goodnight. Wes ran Pinnacle Distribution out of Cheyenne, Wyoming. We'd known each other for 12 years, mostly through industry conferences and the occasional shared bid that we'd amicably split. He was the kind of competitor you actually liked. Straight shooter, paid his suppliers on time, and had the kind of reputation in the corridor that took decades to build. He'd reached out to me 3 times over the previous 5 years. Nothing aggressive, nothing inappropriate, just a standing offer. The last message had come in the previous January. "Cole, the door's still open over here. We build a real role for you, not a courtesy title." I'd never replied to that one. On the 4th day, I called him. He picked up on the 2nd ring, said, "Took you long enough." We met 2 days later at a steakhouse in Cheyenne, halfway between his office and mine. Wes was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, ex-military, with the kind of plain-spoken manner that you don't really see anymore in companies above a certain size. He asked how I was doing. I told him. He nodded, didn't make a big deal of it, and got down to business. The offer was $245,000 base salary, 12% profit sharing on the federal contracting vertical, title of Senior Vice President of Operations reporting directly to him. Equity participation through a phantom stock plan with a 5-year vesting schedule. He handed me a printed term sheet with all of it laid out on a single page. Then he said, "Cole, anything you bring with you that's yours, relationships, methodologies, proprietary tools, we acquire on a documented, fair market basis. Your name on the paperwork. None of that work product belongs to us by default garbage. We treat people like adults around here." I drove home that night thinking about the Ask server, the leather portfolio, the 4 federal contracts. Tessa was awake when I got in. We sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She said, "What are you going to do?" I told her. She said, "Good." I called Wes the next morning and accepted. We agreed on a start date 6 weeks out, enough time to give Reeves a clean 2-week notice, plus a buffer for me to handle some personal matters before transitioning. I drafted my resignation letter that afternoon. 2 weeks' notice. Professional. No editorializing. Printed on plain paper. But before I delivered it, I did one more thing. I sat down and drafted 4 separate emails. One to each of the federal procurement officers I'd built relationships with over the years. Real relationships, not Reeves. Industrial relationships. Not Reeves. Industrial relationships. Mine. The emails were straightforward and entirely professional. I informed each contact that I would be transitioning out of my role at Reeves Industrial Supply, effective in 2 weeks, that my last day would be the 14th, and that going forward I could be reached at Pinnacle Distribution in Cheyenne. I included Wes's contact information. I noted that I would be personally overseeing the federal contracting vertical at Pinnacle in my new capacity, and that I remained available to discuss any concerns about contract continuity. I didn't badmouth Reeves. I didn't editorialize. I just informed them of a change in my contact information, which I was fully entitled to do, and which, in 2 of those 4 contracts, I was technically obligated to do under the continuity of personnel clauses I'd drafted years before. I sent the emails. Then I walked the resignation letter down to Garrett's office. He was on the phone when I knocked, held up a finger without looking at me, finished his call, and leaned back in the leather chair Hollis used to sit in. The same chair, actually, just relocated from Hollis's old office 2 floors down. I put the letter on his desk. He read it, said, 2 weeks. 2 weeks. He asked where I was going. I told him Pinnacle. His face did something complicated, not anger exactly. More like the look a man gets when he realizes he's been hearing a smoke alarm for the last 15 minutes and only just figured out what it was. He said something about how this didn't have to be the way it ended. He said something about a consulting arrangement we could discuss. He said that he hoped this wouldn't create awkwardness with the family. I told him that Tessa and I had talked it through and we were good. He asked me to reconsider. He said with what I think he believed was genuine emotion, "Cole, my dad started this business with nothing." I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "Garrett, your dad started this business with 1 truck and a phone book. I built the rest of it. We both know that." I walked out before he could answer. The next 2 weeks were strange. People who had barely acknowledged me in 9 years suddenly wanted to grab lunch. Diane, the CFO, came by my office on the second day and closed the door and stood there for a minute with her hands in the pockets of her cardigan and finally said, "Cole, I want you to know I had no idea this was happening. None of us did. I'm really sorry." I told her I appreciated it, and I meant it. She wasn't the problem. She'd just been at the table. Ronnie from Phoenix called me on a Friday night, and we talked for 45 minutes, mostly about nothing. He didn't bring up Bo. He didn't have to. We both understood what was happening. Bo, for his part, started shadowing me with a fresh Moleskine notebook. He had questions. So many questions. About the BLM contract renewal cycle. About the supplier rate cards. About why we routed certain orders through Casper instead of Farmington. About how the federal compliance audit process actually worked. I answered every single one, patiently, completely. If I was going to leave, I was going to leave. I was going to leave clean. I owed that to the employees, even if I didn't owe it to the family. But there were 2 things I didn't hand over. The first was the procurement and logistics platform. Bo didn't ask about it directly, which told me he didn't actually know it existed as a separate standalone tool. To him, it probably just looked like Reeves had efficient logistics. He didn't realize there was a specific system behind it, sitting on a personal AWS account that had been running the company's federal contract operations for 15 years. I wasn't going to volunteer that information. It wasn't deception. I was just declining to give away something that had never been theirs to begin with. The second thing I didn't hand over was the federal client relationships. On my last Friday, around 3 p.m., Bo stopped by my desk and asked if I'd set up warm handoff calls with the BLM procurement officers so he could introduce himself before I left. I told him I'd email him the contact information, which I did. Names, official email addresses, office numbers, everything that was already in the formal contract files. What I didn't tell him was that those officers had heard from me 2 weeks earlier, that they already had Pinnacle distribution in their contact lists, that when Bo called those numbers on Monday morning and introduced himself as the new COO of Reeves Industrial Supply, he'd be calling people who already knew where I'd gone and who were already quietly putting agenda items on their next quarter reviews about whether contract continuity might require some operational reassessment. I wasn't burning Reeves down. I was just no longer carrying their water. I cleaned out my office on that last Friday afternoon. The leather portfolio went into the bag first, then a framed photo of Tessa and our son Owen from the previous summer at the Grand Mesa. The kid sunburned and grinning in a Colorado School of Mines hoodie that he'd worn almost every day since his acceptance letter arrived in March. Owen was 18, starting his freshman year in 2 months. The education fund Hollis had vaguely promised at family dinners over the years, never put in writing, never formalized, had quietly never materialized. Hollis had said something about it again at Easter and had said something different about it at Mother's Day, and by the 4th of July, he had stopped mentioning it at all. We were paying for college ourselves. It was tight. Tessa had picked up extra hours at the school district. I'd put in a couple of weekend consulting jobs the year before to help with the down payment on tuition. We were managing. But it wasn't supposed to be this way. I put the photo in my bag, took one last look around the office that had never quite been mine. No nameplate on the door, no actual door in fact, just a half wall and a desk in the corner because open floor plan promotes collaboration, as Hollis had once told me, and walked out at 5:14 p.m. on a Friday in late October. Monday morning, Bo started making phone calls. My first week at Pinnacle felt like stepping into a building where the air was different. Not better or worse, just different. People made eye contact. People wrote down what I said and then actually did it. I had a real office. Door, nameplate, window facing the rail yard where the supply trains came in. Small things. But after 19 years of a corner desk under fluorescent lights, I noticed. Wes didn't hover. He checked in once a day, asked one question, and let me work. I spent the first 3 weeks doing what I always did when I came into an operation. Listened, mapped, watched. I rode along on 2 delivery runs out to BLM facilities in southeastern Wyoming just to see how Pinnacle's operations actually behaved versus how they looked on paper. I found 6 places in the first 10 days where we were leaving money on the table. None of them obvious, all of them fixable. In week 4, we began the formal acquisition of my procurement platform. Wes's legal team handled it the way Wes had described at dinner. Independent valuation, documented IP assignment, my name on the filing. The number wasn't huge. That wasn't the point. The point was that for the first time in 19 years, something I had built was officially, legally, unambiguously mine, and then mine to license, on my terms, to a company that understood what it was worth. By the end of the second quarter at Pinnacle, our fuel and routing efficiency was up 19%. On-time delivery rates had jumped enough that Wes wanted to feature them in our federal bid documentation, which was being prepared for a Bureau of Land Management contract renewal, covering the 4-state Rocky Mountain corridor, the same corridor, as it happened, that Reeves Industrial had served for the past 12 years. Both companies submitted bids. I knew Reeves's cost structure better than Bo ever would. I knew their margin tolerances, their northern yard weaknesses, their thin spots in the Farmington supply chain. I didn't use any of that information improperly. I just built the strongest bid I could using Pinnacle's actual capabilities, and Pinnacle's actual capabilities, now running on better systems with better data, were genuinely stronger than what Bo had to work with. The contract went to Pinnacle. $14.6 million over 3 years. The week after the award was announced, my phone rang. Loveland area code. I let it go to voicemail. It was Bo. The message ran almost 5 minutes long. The short version, Reeves was struggling with 2 of its other federal renewals. The procurement officers weren't engaging the way they used to, and he was wondering if I might be willing to consult informally, maybe just a couple of conversations off the books, to help smooth things over. He said his dad didn't know he was calling. He said he'd really appreciate it. I listened to the message twice. Then I called him back. I told him I'd be glad to help in a formal consulting capacity. My current rate for external industrial logistics consulting was $425 an hour, billed in 2-hour minimums, with a 6-session retainer required up front. I told him I could have a contract drawn up within the week if he wanted to move forward. He said he'd have to think about it. He never called back. Garrett called me 4 times over the following 6 weeks. I let every single one go to voicemail. The messages started friendly, escalated to wounded, and finally landed on something close to angry. The 4th message used the word loyalty twice. I sat with that word for a day. Loyalty. 19 years of 6 a.m. start times and Saturday morning supplier calls and federal compliance reviews that ran until 9 at night. 19 years of treating their problems like my problems because somewhere along the line I had stopped being able to tell the difference. If that wasn't loyalty, then I didn't know what the word meant. And if it was, then Hollis and Garrett had gotten 19 years of it for free. I called Garrett back on a Sunday afternoon. He answered on the first ring and started talking before I could say anything. About the company, about a restructuring, about how things had been reframed, and there might be a more flexible structure we could discuss now. I waited until he stopped. Then I said, Garrett, you told me to clear out for the next generation. The next generation is doing exactly what you wanted them to do. I'd let them keep doing it. I hung up. 3 months later, a reporter from a Rocky Mountain industry trade publication called me. She'd seen the BLM contract announcement and wanted to talk about the procurement methodology behind Pinnacle's bid. We did a 40-minute phone interview. The article ran the following month. My photo in the print edition, my name in the headline, a full description of the platform I'd built and what it had done for Pinnacle's operational numbers. First time in 19 years, my name had appeared in print connected to the work I'd actually done. Wes framed a copy of the article and left it on my desk without saying anything about it. I noticed it Monday morning. I left it there. Around that same time, I found out through Tessa that Reeves Industrial had quietly sold a 35% stake in the company to a regional competitor based out of Salt Lake City in order to stabilize their cash position after losing the BLM contract and one other federal account. Hollis came out of fly fishing retirement briefly, then went back into it. Garrett was reportedly furious. Bo got moved into a strategic projects role, which is the corporate equivalent of being told to go play in another room. I don't know all the details. I don't need them. What I do know is that at the Western Energy Logistics Conference in Denver that fall, Pinnacle Distribution was recognized for the federal contract win and for the operational improvements we posted over the previous year. Wes said a few words from the podium and then introduced me as the architect behind the work. I shook some hands. I answered some questions. I talked shop with people who actually understood what I was talking about. Tessa came down for the event. She'd driven from Loveland that afternoon. She stood next to me during the reception in a dark green dress I hadn't seen in years. And she looked like a woman who had made a decision a long time ago and was finally getting to see it confirmed. On the drive back up I-25 that night, she told me Owen had made the dean's list his first semester. I'd like to take credit for that, but the kid had always been smarter than me. He called me a few days later and said he'd seen the trade publication article online and that the headline was, "Kind of cool, Dad, in a niche way." That's about as much praise as a 19-year-old engineering student is going to hand out, and I'll take it. We paid for that first year ourselves. It was tight, but every dollar of it was clean. Here's the thing I want to leave you with, because I've thought about it a lot in the 2 years since all of this happened. I spent 19 years building something inside a structure that was never going to give me credit for it. Not because the work wasn't good, not because they didn't know the work was good, but because the structure wasn't designed to see me. I was the son-in-law, the helpful one, The operational backbone that made it possible for other people to stand at the front of the room. I'm not bitter about it, mostly because being bitter would mean I regret the work, and I don't. The work was real. The systems held. The trucks ran. You can be proud of something you built, even if someone else put their name on it, as long as you eventually understand what's yours and what isn't. If you've spent years running someone else's operation, a family business, a company that had your fingerprints on everything but your name on nothing, you already know what I'm talking about. You felt it. That slow grinding realization that loyalty only flows in one direction in certain rooms. So know what you actually own, not what you've contributed to, not what you've been allowed to use. What is legally, documentably, provably yours, your relationships, your systems, your methods, your name in the right clause of the right contract. Document everything. Date everything. Save copies on drives that aren't theirs. And the day you finally have to walk out, and trust me, if you're in the wrong room, that day is coming. Don't walk out angry. Walk out prepared. That's when everything changes. 2 years out from that Thursday morning in the conference room, I think about cause and effect a lot more than I used to. Not in any grand philosophical way, just the quiet, practical version of it. The version that says every choice you make and every choice somebody else makes about you leaves a fingerprint somewhere. And eventually all those fingerprints add up to something. Garrett made his choice when he stood at the head of that table and gave my job to his kid. He thought he was making a personnel decision. What he was actually doing was telling me, in front of 11 people, exactly what 19 years of my labor had been worth to him, and exactly what kind of man he was when nobody was forcing him to be anyone else. Hollis made his choice years before that, when he hired me on a handshake and never once revisited the conversation. Bo made his choice when he walked into a building he hadn't earned and started using words he didn't understand. None of them were villains. They were just people doing what the structure they built allowed them to do. I made choices too. I chose to stay quiet for 19 years. I chose to trust people who had given me no real reason to trust them. I chose to keep building year after year on the assumption that someone would eventually notice. That was on me. I won't pretend otherwise. But here's what I've come to believe. The work matters. It always matters. It always matters. Even when nobody sees it. Even when somebody else takes the credit. The integrity you bring to the desk every morning isn't a transaction with the people above you. It's a transaction with yourself. I built real systems at Reeves because I wanted to build real systems, not because I expected a reward. And when the day came that I needed those systems to belong to me, they did. Not by accident. Because I'd kept clean records, kept ownership clear, and never pretended my work was anyone's but mine. That's the part I'd want my son Owen to understand if he ever asks me about any of this. You don't compromise the work just because the room around it is unfair. You do it well anyway. You document it. You date it. You keep your own counsel, and you watch what's actually happening, not what people tell you is happening. You stay kind, but you don't stay naive. Those are different things. And when the moment finally comes, and for most of us, in some form it does come, you don't show up angry. Anger is loud and it's blinding and it doesn't move anything heavy. You show up steady. You show up with your records in order, your relationships intact, and a clear-eyed understanding of what you actually own. That's not revenge. That's just being a grown man who paid attention. The strength to walk out clean isn't given to you. It's something you build, quietly, over years of doing the right thing when nobody's watching. The day you need it, it's there. Or it isn't. And that day always tells the truth.